What a great morning of worship, and happy Father's Day to all you dads. We're going to continue our study in miracles today while simultaneously celebrating the high and holy calling of fatherhood. So we're going to turn our attention to one of my favorite fathers in Scripture, other than the good father that we sang about. And he's my favorite not because he did anything necessarily heroic or noteworthy. It's not because his fearlessness and unwavering faith made him a part of a miracle. He's one of my favorite dads because, having come to the end of his parenting rope, he was still hanging on, still fighting for his son, and he was being honest about his struggles. And it was his desperation that created a thin place. We've been talking about thin places. It's those places where we can meet God and see Him work. It is those places where God takes divine action. Call it a miracle. It's where God works on our behalf. Now, the story actually follows immediately on the heels of the Transfiguration, where the glory of Jesus, which is typically masked by His flesh, came bursting forth. And during that time, there was a message from God in the clouds, and He said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With Him I am well pleased. Listen to Him." Okay, it was a message for Jesus and His inner circles, the leaders of the disciples, Peter, James, and John. Jesus needed to hear that message because He needed encouragement from heaven to finish the job, to endure the cross for our sake. And those disciples needed to be encouraged to trust Him during and after the devastating days that were soon to come. It was for them a remarkable mountaintop experience, and made more difficult for them because Jesus made them promise that they wouldn't say a word. It was a great mountaintop experience, but as you know, life teaches us what goes up must come down. And when He and His guys came down from that mountaintop experience, they literally descended into chaos. There was bedlam in the streets, and guess who? It was the other disciples in a heated argument with the teachers of the law, and things were about to spin out of control. I want to pick up the action right there. If you have your Bibles and want to follow along, we're going to be in Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 14. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet Him. "What are you arguing with them about?" He asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately cowered because it was afraid. That's not what happened. It immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It's often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," Jesus said, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." Some versions say only by prayer and fasting. Now, there is so much for us to learn from this chaotic, very thin place that is not surprisingly in a valley. Valleys are often thin places. Now, the first people that see Jesus having descended from the mountain are the crowds. Mark tells us they're overwhelmed with wonder and come running straight to him. Now, why? Why were they overwhelmed? Well, it's not because he was still glowing from the transfiguration. His divinity was once again neatly concealed by his flesh. They were amazed because Jesus appeared at just the right time. Like when your kids are having a meltdown and you show up to settle an argument before things spin wildly out of control. That's what happened here. Jesus showed up to make things peaceful again. When he arrived, he looked at his disciples and said, "What are you arguing with these guys about this time?" See, this wasn't their first run-in. The teachers of the law were always looking to demonstrate that Jesus and his merry men were frauds. That happened when they happened upon this scene where the disciples are trying desperately to cast out an evil spirit. They immediately sprung into action. The dad had brought the child to Jesus. Please don't miss that. The dad had brought the child to Jesus. That's the right move. Jesus had already invited the weary and the burdened to come to him, and he would give them hope and rest. But when the dad brought the child to Jesus, Jesus was up on the mountain being turned inside out. So the disciples, hearing about this terrible story of this tormented young man, got right to work. They had actually done this kind of thing before. When Jesus sent them out 2 by 2, they successfully worked in the deliverance ministry. And they knew they could do it again. Delivering this boy would be like taking candy from a baby. They had done it before, and they would do it again. They had great self-confidence. And it was their self-confidence that created all kinds of trouble. Now, let's just take a step back and understand that this scene is the quintessential picture of the battle that rages between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness, which Jesus previously described in John chapter 10, verse 10, when he said, "This thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy." That's the dark objective. "But I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly." That battle is raging in this scene. The boy that the disciples were trying to deliver was being tormented by a demon. The thief was literally stealing his life and destroying his family. And the religious leaders, compromised as always by control issues, were unknowingly allied with the dark side, trying to steal, kill, and destroy the confidence and with it the ministry of the disciples. Now, we have to stop and ask, why in the world were the religious leaders hassling them, and on what grounds? Well, part of the issue was that according to their laws, The disciples were not qualified or authorized to deal with those kinds of issues. The teachers were no doubt explaining to them that they had no authority, as well as pointing out that their failure to cast the demon out proved their point. They weren't getting the job done because they weren't authorized by God. Now, the result of their challenge was that the disciples got defensive and doubled down. They determined that they were going to prove the teachers of the law wrong. They could do it, and they would do it. What they didn't realize was that they had fallen hopelessly into the enemy's trap. He had tricked them into distraction. Now, remember, as we've talked about the thin places, those places where we experience divine action, we learned that there are two elements that make for thin places. One is despair, and we have that in spades here. The dad was desperate. And the other is focus. So there's despair and focus. But not just focus on the issue, it is focus on God. And that's where the disciples went wrong. In the melee, they focused on their past performance, believing that it would enable them to do it again, and they focused on their enemies. And guess what? In the process, they lost sight of that precious boy that they were there to help, and they lost connection with their power source, God. In short, I think we could say that the disciples were unhinged and unplugged. And that's what Jesus addressed after the Father told him of the disciples' failure. Turning his attention to the disciples, Jesus said, and this is pretty shocking, to the disciples, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you?" And we know he had it when he said, "How long do I have to put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Bring the boy to me." Now, Jesus states emphatically and correctly that the disciples are unbelieving. Well, that seems weird, doesn't it? This is a group of 12 who had left everything to follow him. They clearly believed in God, and they believed him sent from God. So what did he mean when he said they were an unbelieving generation? The word he used meant that their belief, their faith, which was present, was simply and sadly misplaced. Okay, right belief would have made them, in the face of that challenge, totally dependent upon God. And they weren't. From their perspective, in the moment, from Jesus' perspective, in that moment, they were actually functioning as unbelievers. Now, we need to just pause right there for a moment and recognize the possibility that we, the believers, can function as unbelievers. If Jesus can label the disciples as unbelievers, he could certainly use that term with us. In Matthew's account of the story, after the boy had been delivered and the disciples met with Jesus to learn where they had melted down, Jesus made an interesting but somewhat confusing observation. Listen to what he said in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. Because, when they said, "Hey, why couldn't we get that done?" He said, "Because you have so little faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. will be impossible for you. Now, let's engage here and ask the question, how can little faith be the problem if it only takes faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain? Now, by the way, a mustard seed is about half the size of a peppercorn. It ain't much. It's just a little bit. So how could faith be too little? How does that work? How can it be too small if it takes such a small amount? What was he talking about? It was about the object of the faith, not the amount of faith. The issue was the object of their faith. Their faith was little because it was misplaced. The object of their faith, the thing they were trusting to get the job done, which, if you'll recall, was themselves, was too small for the task. They had faith in themselves because of their past experience with God. It wasn't in that moment in their great God, and therefore their faith was little. It was the object of their faith that defined its weakness. And as the demon refused to come out of the boy, they doubled down, trying harder and harder and harder. Then, as they were heckled by the religious leaders, they got angrier and angrier. They truly believed they could do it and they would do it. But what they needed to believe was that only God could do it. Little faith for them, as for us, is believing in the wrong thing. Now, just as an aside, in today's church, and in particular, in what we hear dubbed the faith movement, our little faith is in faith itself. Okay, we are told if we have strong faith, then God will do what we ask Him to do. Faith in faith is little faith, as Jesus described it. We don't need to have faith in faith. That's like having faith in yourself. We need to have faith in God, and then the places become very thin. Now, don't misunderstand me. Faith is a necessary ingredient, but trusting faith is like believing that power lines generate power. Using that analogy, Jesus is saying you can have one little line to your house, or you can have 1,000 power lines to your house, but if those lines aren't connected back to the power source, you will never have electricity. The disciples weren't connecting to the power source, and therefore they had no power to deliver the boy. That was the problem. Now, back to the story in Mark. Jesus tells them in the chaos to do what they should have done to begin with, and what the boy's father was trying to do to begin with. Bring the boy to me. Bring the boy to me. Now, the most important lesson he could teach them here is that doing his work, seeing his results, requires his involvement. Power does indeed flow through the lines of faith, but those lines have to be connected back directly to God. To be delivered, the boy should have been brought to God in faith. And by the way, their prayerlessness revealed that their little faith, what little faith they had, was misplaced. Now that God was there in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, they could bring him to Jesus and let God handle it according to his will. Now, that is a very important part of the program. Okay? Faith, trusting God, even faith that is connected to God, believing that God can, we still have to let God be God. He gets to decide. But through our faith, we're set up to be in a thin place. Now, after the boy is brought to Jesus, look what happens in verse 20 of Mark chapter 9. So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Can you imagine how devastating that was for the father? When the demon saw Jesus, it responded violently. Now, it's at this point that Jesus turns his full attention to, we would think, the boy. But he actually turned his attention to the father. Even though the boy is rolling around on the ground and foaming at the mouth. Now, look what happens in verse 21. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has this been going on? His entire life, from childhood. And listen, it's often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help. If you can, everything is possible for one who believes. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Now, what happened? The father tells Jesus the tragic story of the boy's life and concludes by saying, if there's anything you can do, please help us. And Jesus responded, of course, by saying, what do you mean if? All things are possible to those who believe. Not in themselves, not in their circumstances, not in their experiences, but in the one true God. And the father responded with those famous words, the words that can be uttered by every authentic follower of Jesus who finds themselves in a valley. I do believe. Help my unbelief. Now, you remember when Jesus said the disciples were an unbelieving generation? Okay, the word the dad used there is slightly different from the word that Jesus used when he labeled his disciples with that sobriquet. The father's word means, help me with it's not about misplaced belief. The father's word for unbelieving is more about doubt. There is a significant lack of confidence in the power of God for the challenge at hand. So this dad simultaneously believes that Jesus could. He is a believer in Jesus, but he doubted that he would. Does that feel familiar? I think everybody who believes in Jesus believes he can. The unbelief comes when we wonder if he will. And it makes sense for this dad, right? I mean, he could be thinking, like, why now? Maybe my son's just too far gone, or maybe the job is too big for Jesus. Even Jesus. He didn't know that Jesus would soon rise from the dead. And all that doubt is understandable, right? What you have to remember is that he was at the end of his rope, barely hanging on by a thread, and he was pushed there by setback after setback after setback. And three of them emerge in this story. The first one that we encounter is, we need to remember, he had the setback of many moons. How many moons had come and gone while he waited for God to hear his prayers and heal his son? He told Jesus he had been going through this for as long as he lived. It had been a long, long battle, and he was tired, weary, and wondering if it was ever going to end. Sometimes it just feels like things will never change. It's the setback of many moons. But he also had the setback of the disciples' failure. The church, the people who believed in Jesus, let him down. They said they could do it. They said they had done it before. As a matter of fact, he had heard stories about Jesus and his guys in the deliverance ministry, so he got his hopes up. He brought his son to Jesus. He wasn't around, so he gave him to the disciples. And they tried, but nothing happened. It was another setback. And he wondered, if they can't do anything, can anyone? Is there any hope? And then he had the setback of the current crisis. You remember when the boy was brought to Jesus, what happened? The demon flexed. He threw him to the ground. He's rolling around, even foaming at the mouth. The demon not only wanted to claim the life of the child, but he wanted to destroy the hope of the dad, and it was working. Help me in my unbelief. Jesus told him, this is possible, but the power is going to flow through your belief. And he said what we would say, I think if we had the courage to be honest in the moment, what we certainly say in our hearts every time we seek a thin place. We need a thin place, but wonder if we will ever find one. I do believe, but help my unbelief. I do believe you can. That's why I believe in you. But I'm just not sure you will. Verse 25, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, they wanted to see the boy rolling around on the ground. He rebuked the impure spirit, "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And that's exactly what happened. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus, who came that they might have life and have it more abundantly, took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and the boy stood up. That dad may not have had much faith. Probably about the size of a mustard seed. But what faith he had was well placed. It was in Jesus. That's why he brought the boy to Jesus to begin with. And guess what happened? In that case, according to God's will, Jesus delivered. And when the dust settled, and the disciples went inside away from the crowd, they asked him, We did it like on the trip. Remember when we went around, we cast out demons. What happened this time? And Jesus answered succinctly, this kind can come out only by prayer. What did he mean by that? Prayer is the demonstration of well-placed faith. In other words, what Jesus was saying is there are some challenges we face, some hurdles we encounter that we can't handle, and we need the wisdom to recognize it. And if we place even what little faith we can muster, mustard seed faith, in the big God of heaven, mountains can be moved. Setbacks can be overcome. And prayer is the proof of the right kind of dependent faith. Prayer is the proof of faith. Do you pray? The boy's dad, he had it right from the very beginning. He brought his son to Jesus. Unfortunately, Jesus wasn't there. But in bringing him to Jesus, he was a model for every believer, and in particular, a model for DIY dads. There's some things you just can't fix yourself. There is an end to our wisdom. There is an end to our resources. There is an end to our power. But you know what the scripture says? When we are weak, He is strong. When we are weak, and admit it, we make space for God to work. We experience those thin places where God springs into action on behalf of us and our families. And if our families are going to experience those transformative thin places where we see God at work, dads, you got to bring your family to Jesus. What we learn from Job in the scripture is that the father serves as essentially the priest for the family. The priest does two things. The priest speaks on behalf of God to the people and speaks to God on behalf of the people. He is the intermediary. According to God's design, divine design, dads, we're the priests. If we have faith, not in ourselves, not misplaced, but if we have faith in God, then we bring our families to Jesus. Bring the child to me. Bring the issue to me. Bring your marriage to me. Some challenges are only going to be solved through prayers that invite God to work. Do you believe? Yeah, I believe. Do you pray? If you believe, you pray. Some kinds, that kind, and maybe the kind you're dealing with, will only come out through prayer. Let's bow our heads. It begins with belief. Faith, remember, is the line through which God's power works. Faith, when rightly placed, is in Jesus. The question that we have to begin with is, have you placed your faith in Jesus? He is the answer to the thief who steals, kills, and destroys. The thief wants to steal your life away. Jesus came that we can have life. What does it mean to believe in Jesus? It means that we believe the good news that God loved us so much that He sent Jesus out of heaven, stepping into time, so that He would deliver us from the controlling hand of the enemy, from the wages of our sin, which is death. Belief means that you trust Jesus to be your deliverer for your life. Have you placed your faith in Jesus? That's where it begins. And then, having believed, keep believing. Don't do like the disciples and think, okay, we got what we needed the first time. We don't ever have to look back. We don't have to be dependent upon Him. We can handle this ourselves. It's not true. Whatever you're facing, whatever your family's facing, bring them to God in prayer. If you believe, if your faith is rightly placed, then you pray. Some challenges are only overcome through prayer. God, we're so grateful for the lesson that this Father who